Most behavior changes in dogs do not begin with something obvious or dramatic that immediately captures your attention. They begin quietly, in moments that feel too small to matter and too subtle to take seriously at first. A slight hesitation before responding, a brief shift in focus, or a pause that did not exist before. These moments seem insignificant, but they are never random. At first, everything still looks normal on the surface, and that is what makes these changes so difficult to detect early. Your dog still listens, still follows through, and still appears engaged in the same way they always have. There is no clear breakdown and no obvious problem presenting itself. But something underneath has already started to move. Dogs do not move from one behavior to another in a sudden or unpredictable way without any buildup. They transition through a series of small adjustments that accumulate over time and gradually reshape their responses. Each adjustment is subtle enough to pass unnoticed on its own. But together, they create a shift that becomes impossible to ignore once it reaches a certain point. Now watch what happens when you repeat a familiar interaction that has always been consistent. The response is still there, but it arrives slightly later than expected, just enough to feel different if you are paying attention. That delay is not hesitation in the way most people think of it. It is processing. Over time, that delay begins to appear more frequently, not just in one situation but across multiple interactions. The response still happens, but it feels less immediate and less automatic than before. That difference starts to create a subtle tension in the interaction. And that tension is the early stage of change. Most owners dismiss this phase because nothing has actually failed yet in a visible way. The dog is still doing what is being asked, so there is no reason to question it. But what is being missed is how the response is changing, not whether it exists. And that distinction matters more than it seems. Now watch what happens as this pattern continues to repeat over time. The pauses become slightly longer, and the consistency of the delay becomes more noticeable. The behavior is still present, but it is no longer stable in the same way. It begins to feel conditional rather than automatic. This is where the shift starts to build in a way that affects everything else. Because once a response becomes conditional, it opens the door for variation. And variation introduces unpredictability. Not immediately, but progressively. At this stage, your dog is not refusing and is not ignoring in the way people often assume. The dog is still engaged, still aware, and still capable of responding. But the internal process that leads to that response has changed. And that change is what begins to reshape behavior. Now consider how many times this interaction happens without you actively noticing the difference. Each repetition reinforces the new pattern slightly more. Each delay becomes part of what is expected rather than what is unusual. And over time, that expectation becomes the new baseline. This is why behavior changes rarely feel sudden to the dog, even when they feel abrupt to the owner. The dog has already gone through multiple stages of adjustment before anything becomes obvious. What you see at the end is simply the final stage of a longer process. And that process has already been completed internally. Now watch what happens when attention begins to shift along with the delay. Your dog may still respond, but the focus is not as immediate or as locked in as it once was. There may be a brief glance away, a slight distraction, or a moment where attention is divided. These are not random occurrences. They are extensions of the same process that started with a simple delay. Because once timing changes, attention often follows. And when attention shifts, behavior becomes less predictable. Not chaotic, but less consistent. At this point, most owners begin to feel that something is different, even if they cannot clearly define what it is. The behavior is still there, but it no longer feels the same. There is a subtle loss of certainty in how the dog responds. And that feeling is accurate. Because the structure that once supported the behavior has already begun to change. Not in a dramatic way, but in a gradual and controlled way that reflects how the dog is adapting. And that adaptation continues with every interaction. Now watch what happens when the same pattern appears in new environments or different contexts. The delay and attention shift are no longer limited to one situation. They begin to show up in multiple areas of behavior. And that is when the change becomes more visible. This is where the shift starts to move from subtle to noticeable. Not because it suddenly appeared, but because it has spread far enough to be seen clearly. The pattern is now consistent across different situations. And consistency makes it undeniable. Most people believe this is the point where the problem begins. But in reality, this is the point where the problem becomes visible. The beginning happened much earlier, in moments that felt too small to matter. And those moments were overlooked. Now consider what happens if nothing interrupts this progression. The delays become longer, the attention becomes less focused, and the responses become less reliable over time. Not immediately, but steadily. And that steady change is what reshapes behavior completely. This is not about a single moment where everything changes at once. It is about a sequence of small moments that build on each other without interruption. Each moment adds pressure to the next. And over time, that pressure creates a clear shift. So the real moment to pay attention is not when behavior disappears completely. It is when behavior starts to feel slightly different in ways that are difficult to explain. That is where the process begins. And that is where it can first be seen. Because once those small moments start repeating, they are no longer small. They are part of a pattern. And that pattern is what ultimately defines how your dog behaves moving forward.